Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Markets and Morality, the show which takes a look at the issues which divide people often lumped together on the right of politics. I'm Emma Revell, Head of Public Affairs at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and in this episode I'll be asking, how do we fix childcare? In 2021, women are no longer forced or expected to be stay-at-home mothers, and many actively look forward to returning to work after having children, but the cost of childcare weighs heavy on most parents. A 2017 IEA report found that families were spending upwards of a third of their income on childcare, with government spending adding an additional $7 billion a year, both figures that will surely have risen since then. The incredible burden often leaves families struggling to choose between a career and a salary and childcare for their children. How can we improve standards and reduce barriers to access for those who want to use childcare? My guests today, who have two fairly divergent opinions on the solutions to that question, are IEA Director of Communications Annabel Denham and journalist, commentator and author of the book What Women Want, Fun, Freedom and an End to Feminism, Ella Whelan. Thanks both for joining me. Now, as I said at the top of the show, this series explores the differences of opinion between people that are often quite lazily bundled together as being on the right, as though we agree on everything. So I'll kick off by asking very briefly, with much more nuance than our opponents tend to do, how would you both describe your personal politics? Ella, if you want to go first.
It's difficult these days because I think left wing means something that I don't recognise it to mean. It most of the time means that you are sort of pro the more divisive version of identity politics, that you maybe like Corbyn, that you maybe support Black Lives Matter. There's a very weak idea of what left wing means, but I'm a more, I'd say I'm something of an old school leftist, socially, economically. But I guess an easy way of saying it is that these days I'm a Democrat. I'm up for any discussion that involves more freedom of speech, freedom of protest, and more involvement in democracy. So there's a very long-winded way of explaining myself.
No, long-winded is fine. It's all about nuance. Annabel, what about you?
Sure. Well, I guess I describe myself as a free marketeer. I'm libertarian-ish. I believe that markets are the best way of organising human affairs that involve scarce resources. I think that we need markets in areas that are not currently present, such as education and healthcare, welfare or land use planning. I'm pro-free speech, I'm pro-immigration. And I don't think that the case can be made too strongly that the adoption of pro-market ideas is what's raised living standards in recent decades by a huge amount.
Fantastic. So we'll move on to discussing childcare. Ella, you've argued that the state could actually be the solution to the childcare problem I described at the top of the show. You wrote in 2019 for the Times that society should view childcare as a collective political issue for society to work out, rather than a burden for mothers and fathers to struggle with on their own. Can you take us through that and explain that a little bit more?
Well, it was just me throwing out an idea of, I don't have a 10-point plan or a build back better plan or whatever it is we're calling manifestos these days, on how to work it out. I'm not an economist, I don't have a budget, but I think that it's when you anecdotally or even sort of socially talk to particularly young women or families, their main problem and the main thing that occupies their mind if they're in the business of having kids is the provision of childcare. And this whole kind of recent juggling between how much maternity leave you give someone, or paternity leave, or shared leave, or all the tinkering around with the ways in which the sort of very minute and conditional ways that the government provides families with the resource of childcare doesn't seem to be working. In fact, actually, it's a really limited way of looking at what is involved in child rearing, because often it's for the first X number of months of a child's life, which actually most people will tell you, bar the sleepless nights, are probably some of the easiest, because you just got this thing that you've got to keep fed and you've got to keep sleeping. It's when kids get a bit older that it becomes a bit more complicated. And so I just thought, like the NHS, like other things that we view as a societal good, and as a means to allow people to have good quality of lives and free up people's access to other areas of life, childcare should be seen less in terms of a sort of as a part of policy that is akin to food banks, or something that you just kind of that is just money thrown at it and it sort of manages to roll along, but actually see it much more politically as something that could alleviate a lot of the issues we have in relation to women's freedom, and most importantly, I think, shut up some of the bleating feminists who keep going on about the gender gap, the gender pay gap. Provision of childcare would literally solve that overnight. So for all of those reasons, I just think it's a political challenge worth putting at the feet of politicians today.
Annabel, you'd probably argue that the state is more of the problem when it comes to childcare, not the solution. In what ways would you argue that the state actually exacerbates the childcare issue for parents?
Well, sure. I mean, I'll start by touching on some of the points in the areas where I think Ella and I agree. I don't think that enough attention is being given towards childcare and the problem that it presents for families. I agree that for the first, let's say, 12 months, if a woman is going to take 52 weeks, or indeed a man is going to take 52 weeks of paternity pay, that actually that's an easier period to get through in terms of juggling career and parenting than what happens when your child is 1, 2, 3, 4, or even when it starts school. I think we could probably also agree that the current situation is a bit of a mess. What we have is a situation where the government is trying to succeed and deliver on 3 conflicting objectives. Those are educational outcomes, affordability, and female labour market participation. Well, you could just see from looking at those that that's going to create a lot of problems. You've got some government departments and policymakers pushing for one thing and others pushing for another, which is possibly the reason why we've got the mess that we have at the moment. I would disagree with Ella by saying that I would actually see childcare as a good like any other, and I would like to see increased consumer choice, not individuals, parents having that choice taken away from them. I think it should be like going for a meal or buying a car, where people want to have the freedom to choose rather than to have to take what they're given, which is what we get with state schooling. And I think, just to see plainly the problems that we have at the moment between the state and childcare provision and private childcare provision, look at the flexibility that you can get through private nurseries, where parents are able to drop the children off at any time that suits them, where they tend to run throughout the year rather than solely during term time. State providers, you tend to only get term time nursery. You can only send your children between, let's say, 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. and you simply don't have the consumer choice that I think a lot of parents are craving. And therefore, I would see childcare like any other good. In terms of full nationalisation of the childcare sector, everybody wants subsidies for rail, cheaper energy, but you can see the appeal. But at the end of the day, someone has to pay for it. And I can't really see why parents, rather than the general taxpayer, wouldn't pay for childcare. Now, of course, you've got the question of those on the lowest incomes, and indeed, poorer families will need subsidising. But again, I don't understand the rationale behind subsidising everyone rather than focusing on those families who need it most. But I'll stop there because I suspect we're going to go on to the mess that is government involvement in childcare at the moment later on in the conversation.
Childcare can be framed often when it's discussed around parents' needs, so access and affordability. But I think it's important that we also touch on what the purpose of childcare is. Is it about increasing female participation in the labour market? So is it just important that we allow mums to get back to work if they want to do so? Or is it about targeting additional support, in a kind of sure start fashion? Is it about helping kids make sure that when they get to school, they're all on a level playing field? Ella, how do you view, the purpose of childcare?
So I don't have a huge amount of time for the kind of career woman feminism. I'm reviewing this book by Marianne Seeger at the moment about the authority gap, and it's driving me mad because it's, that kind of view is exceedingly bourgeois, it's exceedingly limited, and it's obsessed with smashing glass ceilings, which for the majority of women is just never going to be of interest politically or even personally. However, the problem with, and this is why I've not got rose tinted glasses about the idea of state provided childcare, it would have to be done under the right government, and it would have to be in the right way, like all things, because the Sure Start programme, for example, or previous Labour Party policies back through the Blair years that were involved in very much a kind of programme of making a virtue out of removing kids from the family environment very early on, as a means to train out the sort of what they saw as the kind of negative things that kids would pick up from their working class parents. There's kind of fascinating policy documents from the time talking about the need to mix working class kids in with more middle class families so that they unlearn the kind of what picking their nose behavior that they learned from their mums and dads in the estate. With those kind of early intervention programs, even like what I think is Kate and Will's now at the moment are sort of championing this idea of early years intervention, this obsession with the idea that everything that happens to your newborn, let alone your sort of toddler, is kind of scars them and stays with them for life, is really insulting, and particularly insulting to working class families who do not raise little idiots, as is suggested by these programs. I really think it's about choice, and I sort of don't really understand the aversion. I have no problem with private childcare if people want to use it. The problem is just that it's very expensive. I mean, that's literally just the main problem, is that it's very expensive. But also that I think more importantly, coming to the point about why the whole of society should fund this or be involved in this rather than just parents, I think it's quite an important political point, which doesn't get made enough, which is that the raising of children should not be, I think it has become, but it should not be a sort of alienated and individualistic act. There's a huge amount of misanthropic trends in politics today, whether it's, Extinction Rebellion calling on women to birth strike and not have any more kids to save the planet, which is like straight out of, it's like reverse Handmaid's Tale, to the kind of, sorry, Dalston says please, from that kind of dystopian view of women's responsibility, as they put it, to save the planet, to discussions about, actually from feminist quarters, about how important it is for women to become kind of earth mothers, the fetishization of breastfeeding, the kind of regulations actually around formula milk, which stop women from making choices. There's a kind of a real pressure being put on particularly women to be the sole responsibility, if you want to put it crudely, for continuing the human race. It's like we've sort of seen it, disassociated it from this thing that's meant to be a village raises a child, that kind of thing. And I think that actually for the ramifications for women's freedom, whether it be in relation to our or the pro-choice positions on abortion rights or access to contraception, or all these things are linked in with this idea that actually what's going on for women, and it is mainly women who are raising kids and wiping noses and doing the lion's share of the child rearing, that actually that's a social thing. It shouldn't just be on our shoulders, and for very positive reasons, because even if you are your archetypal bachelor who gets queasy at the idea of nappies and has absolutely wants nothing to do with kids at all, that's fine personally, but the process of the project of bringing up a new generation should be something that everybody is actively engaged in.
A very interesting point. Annabel, I suspect you have quite a bit to say on, well, for one thing, the cost of childcare and how it has become to be so expensive.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, we can touch to begin with on why it is that parents in the UK are paying about 3 times those in France and Germany for childcare provision. Childcare was previously a private matter, and that changed in around the 1990s, when there seemed to be this political consensus that formed that government action was needed. And what does government action mean? It means regulation. So, as I said from the top, the government introduced these conflicting objectives. It wanted to raise educational outcomes, it wanted to increase female labour market participation, and it wanted to drive down costs to parents. Now, of course, you simply cannot achieve all these things. If you want to improve educational outcomes, if you want to improve the quality of childcare, then you're necessarily going to make it less affordable. As for the female labour market participation point, I actually agree with Ella about this kind of women are going to, if we can just fix childcare, women are going to smash glass ceilings. If you look at the data, it just hasn't really made that much of a difference, at least the introduction of free childcare for some families. So I think that what we've seen is this increasing legislation, this increasing regulation. A good example is that we now have very strict teacher-child ratios. In fact, we have the strictest ratios of any country in Western Europe, where depending on the age of the child, you have to have one teacher to 3 children or one teacher to 4 children. Now, if a teacher has got certain qualifications, then that ratio is slightly relaxed, but it's nonetheless very strict. We also have training requirements, and we have Ofsted, and we have something called the Early Years Foundation stage, which is technically guidance for nurseries, but if all the other nurseries are subscribing to it, if they're all doing this bureaucratic box ticking, then other nurseries will feel pressure to do the same. So you end up in a situation where nursery staff are actually sat with a clipboard, to tell parents whether their child can thread a piece of string through a pasta shape rather than actually interacting with your child. Because of government regulation, we saw lower cost providers being pushed out. The classic example of this is childminders. And childcare subsidies have also had a very significant displacement effect on private sector activity. So the government now offers all parents 15 free hours of childcare from the age that their child turns 3. That's not something that's mandatory, but a lot of parents will take them up on the offer. For lower income families, that's actually extended to 30 free hours of childcare. But for a range of reasons, we've ended up in a situation where it's pushing out and displacing private sector activity. And therefore, the lessons that we can derive from regulation of the childcare sector thus far is that it's simply not achieving its outcomes, and it's driving up costs for parents. So what I would like to see is just full privatization of the childcare sector, where you can have a range of different providers offering different services. If you've got relaxed parents who care solely about affordability, then they can send their child to a nursery that's got very relaxed teacher-child ratios, if any at all, and where it's more about playing in a safe environment. Or you can have the more tiger parenting approach, where they want to send their child to a nursery that's going to teach their children to read and write by the age of 2, and that would be available to them. But we need to focus on what it is that parents need or desire. We need to offer them the choice available. And by removing all of this government regulation, we'll also be able to make it more affordable, and we'll be able to tackle challenges that nurseries have at the moment, where they're struggling to stay afloat, they're struggling with staff retention, and parents aren't particularly happy with the service anyway. And just to a point that Ella made on Sure Start, I do actually have a degree of sympathy with people who say, what happened to these sorts of schemes. I think that focusing on disadvantaged children is actually exactly what we should be doing, but that's been lost in the general subsidy, the 15 and 30 free hours of childcare that's been given to everyone else. And I would just come back on some of Ella's points around, the village raising the children. I mean, I'm just very uncomfortable with the idea that the government should be parenting our children from an ever younger age and should be imposing more and more levels of bureaucracy and tick boxing exercises on children who ultimately just need to be healthy and in a safe environment, and possibly have some learning and be socialized with other children. I'm just very reluctant about this kind of one-way ratchet that we seem to be on at the moment, where the government is increasingly parenting our children and increasingly parenting us, as we've seen with some of the anti-obesity measures that have been introduced recently. So I think it can be very kind of easy to look over across the North Sea to Scandinavia and see that they've nationalised childcare, and it be quite appealing. But I think we need to realise that the situation that they have in countries like Finland and Sweden is very different to what we have here childcare, and it's not necessarily desirable or something that we should be striving to achieve.
Ella, what do you think about that? Do you think, your suggestion of the government, the state footing the bill and bearing responsibility, society as a whole, for raising children, is it actually just more state interference when it comes to parents and families?
Well, as soon as we're having this discussion, I'm not a politician, I don't have to stick to a brief or stick to limits. I'm allowed to do a little bit of blue sky thinking here, because I think that Annabel's very right to suggest that the current trend in politics, actually you would historically, the Labour Party's been very bad at the kind of interventions into people's personal lives or encroachments into people's personal lives, but the Conservatives in many ways have proven themselves to be just as bad and just as willing to be sort of authoritarian when it comes to public health and other areas of life which they really have no business in meddling in. So no, I wouldn't want a childcare system which meant that children had to have lessons on climate change and were poked with a stick to go around the hall running to make sure that their BMI was at a certain level. And I don't want that. But that doesn't mean that in the abstract, the idea of a more societally involved system of childcare isn't a good thing. I think it's really important. The reason why the village to raise a child thing is a bit of a catchphrase, but I actually think one of the biggest problems we have with child rearing today is not that it's just sort of still left to women, but actually that it has become an increasingly, I've already used the word alienating, but an alienating process for the child as well. Generational, for various social reasons, whether it be the changing nature of populations or the changing nature in which we have decided to live in smaller houses. We don't live with our grandparents anymore. All those things that have pros and cons have meant that increasingly now children grow up very much isolated from other generations, and also because of the historic panics of stranger danger and all that, the paedophile panic of the 90s and sort of the 2000s has meant that there's a kind of real aversion to kids having relationships with other adults or having relationships with people outside of the family home. And that has actively had a detrimental effect. You can see the part of the reason why so many kids are so screwed up now is because they've got no perspective. They've got no means of looking for authority other than their parents. And it's quite tragic. And I think one of those things that could be quite nicely rectified is that if we open up a space where there can be more involvement in child rearing other than parents, and also thinking outside the box. For example, I'm sure like many people, I first earned my bit of pocket money nannying and babysitting. And I remember when I got a bit older and was at university and wanted to do it, I had to go through this thing, and they wanted me to do kind of a degree, or it wasn't a degree, it was some kind of process of getting some kind of diploma. And it was such a headache. And I just thought, I've been babysitting since I was 14. I know how to wipe an arse. I know how to wipe tears. I'm fine. And I think there's the drive to not just sanitize it, but kind of over-regulate it. Could be challenged if you say, let's have some more informal things. And that could just be as simple as there being pots of government money raised, however you want to raise it, that allow communities to decide how they set up these kind of childcare centres. I mean, it's not where I grew up in an estate that has used to have, anyway when I was growing up, quite a strong community. There was a local hall to that estate. It's not outside of the realms of possibility to consider how you might organise a childcare system with everybody being involved in that. Now I know this is where I really break. We were talking about political divisions at the start. I know that what I'm arguing for is something very different to what we currently view. And part of the problem with if I want to go there, living under a capitalist system, is that Tina in contemporary politics rules the day. We are constantly told that there is no alternative. I think that you always should be trying to push for an alternative and say, never mind the context of what we're living in now, though it'd be important. What could we have? What could we do to alleviate the issues that we have at the moment? And if you just push that boundary a bit, then you might get somewhere.
Well, Annabel, I think probably some agreement there in terms of at least less occupational licensing, which, as we know, the IE is written, does force up the cost for nurseries and then naturally for parents.
yes, if we can scrap occupational licensing, that would be a great measure as part of a wider package of deregulating employment and making it as easy as possible for businesses to take on workers as we emerge from this crisis. The number of positions that now require occupational licensing has increased from 1 in 10 to 1 in 5 in the last 2 decades. I just sort of come back on a couple of points that Ella has made there. I think that given the amount of judgment that women face when they are pregnant and in labor and in those early stages of motherhood, and the negative, in my view at least, consequences of organizations like the Leche League making women who are unable to breastfeed feel like failures, of kind of this societal idea now that if you don't have a natural pain-free or pain relief-free delivery, then somehow you've failed. Women being told that they're not supposed to drink during pregnancy, even sort of tiny amounts, and now we had ridiculous guidance from the WHO suggesting that all women of childbearing age should just avoid alcohol lest they accidentally fall into bed with a stranger and wind up pregnant. And I suppose I would just be very wary of any measure that allows communities to put more judgment on the way that people parent, which in my view is and should be a private matter. In terms of some of the points that Ella made about the childcare burden on women, I mean, I do agree, and I think it's a societal, it's a cultural issue. I can't quite see what solutions government can come up with to ensure that women, aren't doing more than their fair share of childcare or housework or, whatever it might be. I think things are moving in the right direction, albeit more slowly than I would like. And, a point that I would just make there is if you look at the data of those countries which, at least on paper, have the highest levels of gender equality, those countries where the question is if there's one job, should it go to a man or a woman? The countries where the vast majority and the greatest number of people are likely to say the woman, or it shouldn't matter. Those are also the countries where you tend to have very high female labour market participation in the public sector. You have very high levels of women who are working part-time, and you have very low levels of female entrepreneurship. And so you have, particularly in Nordic nations, this kind of gender equality paradox where the more that government tries to intervene to make life easier for women, the less women are able to kind of progress professionally. So I think that's just kind of an interesting area that needs to be explored. And of course, those countries are also ones where you tend to have nationalized childcare. Now, let's not forget that in places like Sweden, you do also have private childcare providers. It's just that they're only used by a very small minority. And to that end, we do just need to be a bit sort of cautious about the comparisons that we make between the UK and other nations. If you look at Scandinavia, for instance, in Finland, children start school at the age of 7, and in Sweden and Denmark, it's at 6. So, if you're not starting kids at school until they're 6 or 7, I think there's probably an argument for that, then it does make sense to have some sort of structured system of childcare. But yeah, as I say, I mean, I just think that we're really moving in the wrong direction here on childcare. My concern is that we are going to have full nationalisation of the sector, and that's just going to extract any choice for parents. It's going to lead to a poorer provision. And in fact, what we need to be doing is moving in the opposite direction. We need to identify ways in which we can deregulate and move towards a privatised model and increase that choice and lower costs, and have a wider range of childcare providers.
Perhaps some kind of I'll come to an end by sort of suggesting possibly that some kind of middle ground would be government getting out of the way in terms of occupational licensing and ratios for childcare, but perhaps footing some of the bill in a voucher-based way, because then you get more choice for parents, more options. But as Ella says, more societal buy-in. Perhaps, Ella, what do you think about that?
I think that, you know, there is the kind of stone cold issue of cost, which actually in a different context, Selena Todd was very good on Start the Week on this, I think a month ago, when she was talking about the welfare state, which was to say, of all the problems with the benefit system and all the, you know, the variety of issues that people have with it on both sides, people who are very pro it and people who are very against it, the fact is benefits for working class people act as a safety net. And the reason why that safety net is so important, it's not just because so you don't starve, which is kind of a very crude way that a lot of people on the left see it, but it's so that you have that breathing space to imagine a better life for yourself. So whether it be that you are able to take the unpaid internship if you're in our world of journalism, or whether you're able to do the few weeks with the being someone's apprentice to learn a new skill, you know, whether you're able to take a few leaps and actually think big about stuff rather than have to just be stuck in the rut of the job that can allow you to live and just give you what you need to survive. That's why it's important. And in the same way, I'd really just see childcare as a political project, which is like education and like the NHS, but also as just simply a means through which women can start to think big, start to think independently. And, you know, it's personal choice is very important. I mean, I'm trying to have a kid at the moment. I tell you what, I don't want to work when I'm doing it. I know that it's not easy having a kid, but I'm looking forward to, you know, enjoying being part of my child, if I manage to have one's life. And I'm not one of these earth mothers and all that. I'm going to have the epidural and I'm going to, you know, give them formula milk, and I'm not hazy-eyed about that. But the idea of being a mother really excites me. That's me. That's, you know, and many other women are not like that. And I think reflecting on the fact that the main thing you can point to is that the dire state of women's freedom in society today is pretty much down to our reproductive rights. I don't have any truck with all the other stuff about, you know, panics about Me Too or the authority gap or the gender pay gap or any of these kinds of stuff. It's when we start having kids that the problem arises. And so if we could do things like decriminalize abortion, provide childcare in some kind of a way, give women options, then maybe some of them would start speaking up and saying what it is that they actually want. At the moment, most of us now at the moment are just, you know, it's the classic thing that I tell contemporary feminists, that if you go out on the street today and you say to a woman, you know, what's your main political desire? They're not going to say, you know, have more women in parliament or you know, have a kind of Me Too march. They're going to say, feed my kids and have some space to go and get a coffee with my mum once a week. You know, it's very basic things. And so I just think any kind of innovative ways of looking at how to provide this basic service for society, not just for women, and bridge these more alienating factors that have thrown themselves up over the last 20 years, you know, in my lifetime, of generational isolation and worry, I think. And the kind of, I really, where we very much agree is on this sort of over-regulation of things that are natural, you know, not to get, I'm realizing I do sound like an earth mother in a lot of this, but not to get a kind of like a hippie about it. But, you know, there is a lot of where I might disagree with Annabel is saying that rather than judgment, there is a lot of wisdom to be found in the crowd, in communities. You know, how about other mothers? You know, mums groups can be awful places. They can also be great places. So a bit of innovative, a bit of outside the box thinking, I think, is welcome here.
I think it transpires that a lot like housing, I suppose, childcare is one of those keystone issues that if you fix that, you realise how many other issues are also fixed because they're all built on this one key subject. Thanks, Ella and Annabel, for joining me, and thanks to you for watching. Do let us know your thoughts on how we can fix childcare and all the subsequent issues that arise from it. As always, there'll be an IEA Twitter poll to find out what you think, so don't forget to follow us. We're IEA London on Facebook and Twitter, as well as YouTube, and IEA UK on Instagram. If you want to go a step further and support our digital work directly, you can sign up to support the IEA on Patreon to access exclusive perks, benefits, and priority access to content and much, much more. Head over to patreon.com/IEA London or click the link in the show notes to find out more. And thanks again for watching.